Sam Mendes. Welcome, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, you all know how this works. We have an hour or so to talk through the films that you've chosen so that we can talk a little bit more in detail. This event is, as you know, entitled Your Life in Pictures. But, of course, you had another life, a hugely successful career before you got to the pictures, which was in theatre. How actively did you pursue a career in pictures, or was it an accidental sidestep?
Well, I went to Cambridge not knowing what I wanted to do at all. Theatre, film, when neither of those things were at the forefront of my mind. In fact, I remember going to the Freshers' Fair and sort of scoffing at all the drama stalls. And because I think theatre then presented itself to me, and I tried it and discovered that I loved to do it and that I felt that I had something to say eventually. That was the course I took. Film, I think if you're in any way interested in doing film in this country, certainly 30 years ago when I was at university, it seemed an impossible path to take. There just was no conceivable way of doing it. There were no film courses, there were very, very few ways of getting into it, and all my heroes were either American or European, or the Brits that I loved, the Hitchcocks and the David Leans, had gone away to make their movies. So in a way I put it to the side of my mind, but if I look back, I do think that there were moments when I was at university when I absolutely knew I wanted to direct movies, but I just didn't want to admit it because it seemed like a preposterous dream. And the journey into it was a very, very circuitous one.
And when you did make that journey, can you remember much about the differences and similarities? I mean, how much was transferable from your background in theatre?
I've always said I think that theatre directing and film directing are completely and utterly different in almost every respect. Technically, they are very, very different. And I think if you're working with an actor, for example, what you're seeking to do on stage is to find a way to engage their outside eye so that what they're doing in rehearsal they can repeat. In film, what you're trying to do is the opposite. You're trying to disconnect the outside eye. You're trying to encourage spontaneity and freedom and no, self-editing at all. And that goes for every aspect of filmmaking. Every day is different, every scene is different, every shot is different, every take is different. So I find them very, very different, except in one regard, and that is that I spent 10 years at the Donmar, for example, and many other theatres, telling stories to 250 people a night that lasted 2.5 hours, and learning how to read audiences, how to shift rhythm, how to tell stories that lasted an evening rather than 10 minutes or 15 minutes or a half-hour TV show or whatever. And that muscle is always being re-engaged. And even now I find studios and people for whom I make films are always surprised that I want to put it in front of an audience. Because for me, coming from the theatre, unless it goes in front of an audience, it doesn't feel like it exists. It feels like, how could I not put it in front of an audience? I mean, I remember when I first made American Beauty, them saying, look, this is such an unusual film, you don't have to preview it because an audience might not know what it is, or, which I thought was a very dismissive way of talking to an audience. But nevertheless, they were worried that it was going to score badly in a preview and it would knock me. And I said, actually, I want to go out there and do it because for me, I need to hear whether they laugh, I need to know whether there are boring bits, and, that for me is the moment that it exists for the first time.
It was one of those days where it's a minute away from snowing. And there's this electricity in the air. You can almost hear it, right? And this bag was just dancing with me. Like a little kid begging me to play with it. For 15 minutes. Yesterday I realized that there was this entire life behind things. And this incredibly benevolent force that wanted me to know that there was no reason to be afraid. Ever. was a poor excuse, I know. But it helps me remember. I need to remember. Sometimes there's so much beauty in the world. I feel like I can't take it. And my heart, she's going to cave in.
Shooting, the very first day's shoot on this film, you got to the end of it and decided it was all rubbish and everything except the script did not work, so you made them do it all over again. How did you have the confidence, given that this was your debut, to go up against a studio, to talk to established producers, established stars, and make that decision?
Well, I was very fortunate in a way because everything about it was crap. So it was very clear to me, not on the day, I hasten to add, on the day I was very proud of it. I thought, my God, I've done my first day. Isn't it great? You know, I said action and cut and people turned up and, you know, we finished the scene. I mean, the things that you think about when you haven't really done that before. And then, you know, we shot it on film, so you see the dailies. And I went to the screening room at DreamWorks to watch it, and it was very clear to me that everything about it was wrong. So I was fortunate, because if it had been slightly wrong, I probably wouldn't have had the courage to know that it was wrong, if you know what I mean. But because I felt very, very clear, it was very clearly just not what I wanted. I went to the studio at the end of the second day. In fact, they said, how do you think it's going? And I said, I've got to be honest, I really don't think it's right. Both days, it was the first 2 days. And can you let me do it again, please? And they were slightly taken aback, but I think that after that, they knew I was so adamant about what it was, it clarified what I was trying to do. And from then on, it got increasingly better, I think. After a couple of weeks, I hit my stride.
And how, I mean, similarly, that same confidence, how did that carry on, even though one of the producers was also the writer, Alan Ball? How did you, as a kind of newcomer, come in to something which was so close to him, such a personal thing for him?
It was a brilliantly written, brilliantly judged, and very visually articulate script right from the very beginning. But Alan was not an experienced screenwriter. Alan had started in sitcoms and was actually very disappointed in what had happened to his career, and wrote this script in a way as much out of anger over what had happened to him. And he was a first-time screenwriter. Producers Dan and Bruce were first-time film producers, and I was a first-time director. So actually, it was a gang of people finding out how it worked all at the same time. And that was also helpful, because I never felt patronized or guided by another person. I felt like I was able to discover the movie I wanted to make for myself.
Watching it again now, it still feels incredibly challenging. Did you ever feel that you needed to kind of tone it down, or did anybody try and sort of rein you in and tone it down?
No, nobody ever tried. I mean, and you know, it is challenging. It's a very, very bold orchestration of dissonant tones, the film. It's very unusual in that regard, that you shift from something that has that kind of level of poetry, both visual and spoken, and shift into something that openly theatrical in a way. And those things coexisting was what made the script unusual, and I determined to pursue each tone to its fullest degree. And to not to homogenize it and make it all feel naturalistic. And so what I had in my head from a very early stage was a very, very formal, composed movie. I storyboarded it. I had a very, very specific way of shooting it. I don't really know why. It just was there when I read it. And that, again, that muscle is honed by theatre direction. You read it, and your brain translates it very quickly into image. And that's where, you know, you learn to judge whether the images are any good or not. Later in your career, earlier, I thought, oh, I could, you know, I think you thought it was enough to simply like something to do it. And it's not. You have to have a way in, you have to have some degree of insight, however small, that's yours and yours only, that gives you the feeling that you are the person who should be doing this. And that's the tricky thing, is to find that voice in your head that makes it yours, that make you feel like it's yours. But I always felt attached to the screenplay. From the moment I read it, I thought it was, I had a way of doing it, and from what was in my head to the end result is almost the closest with my first movie than with any other.
A perfectly crafted production, Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
Pablo Escobar.
He made billions from an empire of crime and left his son to pay the price. This is his story.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
There's that hideous statistic about first-time directors who, you know, something like 80% of first-time directors don't make another feature film.
Is that right?
It is right. But was there ever a point when you just thought, oh, God, this is just so hard, I'm going back to, you know, the kind of smaller world of theatre that you...
Oh, I think that every time I make a film, yeah. I've had enough of this, I'm going back and doing a play, and that's how I get my feet back on the ground. But, you know, for me, it's odd, the very fact that we're here talking about my life in pictures, because I don't equate it as a consistent line of movies, because that's not how I worked. I never felt like I went from American Beauty straight to Road to Perdition. What I did was go from American Beauty back to the Donmar, went and sat in my office again and thought, okay, this is real life, and back here, you know, what play am I going to do next? And by the way, what are we going to do next season? And that was my way back into some level of normality.
And so how did you get Road to Perdition?
I was sent it by DreamWorks, who had produced American Beauty, and it was a lumpy script, but I loved the central idea, which was this father and son who were cut adrift in a sort of mid-America in the 30s. And it seemed to me to have a kind of grandeur of almost a Greek tragedy. And the story, I thought, had one great idea, which is that the Tom Hanks character, Sullivan, was forced to kill his own father, or his surrogate father, in order to save his son, which seemed to me an incredible, tragic idea. But there was also this amazing landscape, this desolate landscape, a time when you could be cut adrift in the mythic landscape that was Prohibition-era America. And we shot it in Chicago in the dead of winter, and it was a very solitary and lonely time, coming back from making American Beauty and all the acclaim, and feeling myself very sort of isolated. And a lot of that went into the film.
Let's have a look at how you were feeling at the time then. Do you want to just quickly set up this clip?
Yeah, this is, as I said, Tom Hanks is forced into killing his own surrogate father, played by Paul Newman, in the rainy streets of Chicago in 1930.
I'm glad it's you.
How much of a contrast did that feel, having come off the very talky American Beauty and presumably the talkiness of some of the stage productions you were doing at the time?
I think what you see there is me kind of falling in love with the visual power of the cinema, and the fact that you don't need to speak all the time, and that language is not necessarily the #1 way of conveying story. One of the things that I enjoy most about the process of filmmaking is the mix, the sound mix at the end of the process. And for whatever reason, I could not get that scene right at all. And all the way through the sound mix, it used to drive me mad. Endless machine gun noise. And then right at the end, I said, about a day before we finished, I said, just see what happens if you pull all the sound out and just let it be Tom Newman's score, which by that time, of course, we'd recorded. And that's what you see. And that was done a day before the end of finishing the movie. We just pulled all the sound out. So the first actual machine gun fire you hear is when he kills Paul Newman's character. And that's something that, you know, is interesting about film, is that on the one hand, it's incredibly planned and incredibly, you know, kind of prepped. You know, prep is everything. And on the other hand, there is a kind of freedom there right through to the very end, where you can change huge and substantial things, right, you know, in 5 minutes. And that's very freeing and also very frightening, because there are some films that do not benefit from this process, and there are some that do. And I've always felt like that was the moment that I felt I found the kind of semi-operatic tone that I wanted the film to feel like.
Did you go back to the comic book?
No, the comic book is drawn in a very different style. I love the comic book, but it's much more dynamic. It's much more, it's a comic book, you know. But I'm a big believer in the graphic novel as a form, and I think, I mean, now that's like saying, you know, I like novels or something. I mean, they're everywhere. But at the time, it was quite unusual to have a major film made out of a comic book, a serious movie.
And we should move on quite quickly, but I just wanted to touch on the fact that this was Paul Newman's final live-action role.
Yes.
Kind of how much did the weight of working with an actor like that kind of affect you? How much were you prepared to kind of let him just do his thing, and how much did you feel confident in giving him direction?
Well, you know, it's very rare that one gets to work with one's heroes, and it's even rarer to find that they're still heroes when you finish working with them. And Paul was one of those people. He's just like God, you know, except probably slightly nicer. He really is, he was an extraordinary man. And in fact, the two of the people, Judi Dench is a similar person who makes everyone around them better. They are the least grand people. They want to work. They're only interested in the work. They don't take themselves very seriously, but they take the work seriously. And somebody like that, you might be nervous about for half an hour, but the moment you meet him, he's just an actor who wants to do a good performance. All he was interested in, frankly, was bringing beef sandwiches to the set from a local Chicago cafe that he'd found, and you know, cooking people chicken on a Sunday. I mean, and he had no entourage at all. He had nothing in his trailer. You know, he just wanted to work. He was very suspicious of Hollywood studios. He didn't live on the West Coast. He was a New Yorker. You know, he ran his theater with his wife up in Connecticut, and he was a great man, really. Amazing guy.
Let's sidestep to the Gulf War.
Yes.
Tell us about Jarhead.
Well, you know, I've always challenged myself to do each movie different from the last. And so, you know, I've read this book, Jarhead, and I'd often thought, what would have happened if I had been conscripted, if I had been born in the Second World War, if I'd had to fight? I am a total physical coward. I'd probably be absolutely terrible in those circumstances. And there was this book written by a literate person who was, in a sense, sent to war. So it felt to me like the sort of thing that might happen if I had been in those circumstances. And what it is a very, very strange and unusual book about a man who goes to war and never fires his gun. But it was also, for me, an opportunity to throw out everything I'd done in the first two movies. I didn't want a storyboard. I didn't want the camera to stand still. I wanted to shoot it handheld. I had a new cinematographer, Roger Deakins. We were often shooting on 2 cameras. And I wanted a freedom in front of camera to take away some of the stiffness and some of the formality that I felt making the previous 2 films. So I threw out the rule book, if you like, and started again.
The price of crude oil has nearly doubled. President Bush sends in more troops. Us, 6 times a day, we gather for formation.
Break it down, all of it.
And we hydrate.
Now hold them up.
We patrol the empty desert. And we dehydrate. We throw hand grenades into nowhere. We navigate imaginary minefields. We fire at nothing. And we hydrate some more.
You will hydrate till I get full. There you go, hold it down. Now hold them up.
What made you want to take on a war film in the first place? I mean, why? I mean, you talked a little bit about wanting to try your hand in a different way, but again, there's a sort of weight of history with war films, not necessarily this war. I mean, there are a couple of different examples, but, you know, traditionally war films. How did you think about trying to create something new, trying to avoid cliche, trying to, you know, bring a new statement about war films?
I think the material has to have within it the avoidance of cliche. I mean, you are, you know, influenced by other films to a degree, but for me, my way in is always through the central character. Personally, I felt at that time, you know, I was in a completely new world. I'd moved country. I was living in America. And I felt like I was in a kind of sort of lost in the woods a little bit. artistically. And I think you see it in the movie as well. I think tonally it's uncertain. I think it doesn't know whether it wants, how political it wants to be. I think the script was much more political, and I regretted on numerous occasions after finishing the movie taking a lot of that out.
Does that mean you're less satisfied with this as a film when you look back on it?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain films, you know, people always say, film directors particularly always say, oh, they're like your children, you don't value one over the other, but there are some that didn't complete their education properly, put it that way. So, you know, this one feels like an errant child, you know, and I felt like it was my, you know, flaws that weren't able to craft it the way that I wanted it to be. But, you know, then I look at it again. I mean, I had to watch these movies for this event, and I don't, you know, as a rule, sit around watching my own films. And I was pleasantly surprised by some of it, and I felt, gosh, actually, there's some really good stuff in here. But it doesn't really hang together, for me.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus. A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
Where does Revolutionary Road sit in your family of errant children?
Oh, gosh. Well, it was a movie it was a really unusual film to make because I was directing my then wife in a movie about an unhappy marriage. So, join the dots. Although at the time I would have said absolutely not autobiographical in any way. So there was that. And a movie in which I happen to think she's completely brilliant as well, by the way. And as is Leo. I think they're really remarkable performances, particularly in the second half of the film. I found it very frustrating because it's based on a great novel, and novels are not shaped like movies. Movies tend to be linear on the whole, the best of them, I think. And Revolutionary Road has a problem, which is that it starts with a couple very, very unhappy. It takes them to happiness briefly, and then it takes them back down to where they started. Well, that fundamentally, I always struggled with as a shape, a narrative shape. So what I did was to try to put at the front of the movie the day that they meet, which is the moment when there is hope, and you do see their beauty and their love for each other. But it never quite felt organic. That was something I did in the cutting room. So I was always sort of reaching for I was always fighting against this novelistic shape.
April, sweetheart.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
About ready to leave?
Yeah.
Just gotta get this makeup off.
Well, I guess it wasn't a triumph or anything, was it?
I guess not. I'll be ready in a minute.
Take your time.
Listen, will you do me a favor? Millie and Shep wanted us to go out with them after. Will you say we can't? Say it's because of the babysitter or something.
Well, the thing is, I already said that we could. I mean, I just saw them and I said that we would.
Then
so.
would you mind going out again and saying you were mistaken? That should be simple enough.
Don't you think that's a little bit rude, April?
And I'll tell them myself.
Okay, take it easy, all right? I'll tell them.
It's very acute watching American Beauty and this back to back. There are a lot of similarities in terms of the sort of disintegration of a marriage. Were you very conscious that you were kind of revisiting those themes?
Yes, I mean, I thought very hard before doing this one because I felt, and you know, American suburbia, and I felt there were certain things that, but again, I brought some of what I'd learned, or I felt I'd learned, in Jarhead into the way we shot the movie. Instead of shooting it in sets, we shot it on location. We were trapped in a very, very small house. We shot almost entirely in continuity, which is very unusual. So by the time they got to the end, it was like a pressure cooker, and it was very, very hot, Connecticut summer, very oppressive. And it was weird. It was a weird experience shooting the film for so many different reasons, obvious and not obvious. And it felt like a very different shoot. So it felt like a different world. And I think that you judge stories from their externals at your peril. You know, I think they're tonally very, very different films.
How much did you think about the fact that you were reuniting Leo and Kate after all those Titanic years?
Yes, well, I mean, I was reminded about it every day.
Yeah.
But, you know,
But how much of a responsibility is that? How much do you worry about what an audience is bringing?
I didn't, actually, but I felt it... After we released it, it was freighted with a kind of, you know, oh, here they are again, you know. Timing is a lot with movies, right? I mean, American Beauty was perfectly timed for its place and time in the world. Revolutionary Road was absolutely the worst possible time. It was the middle of an economic crunch. You know, people were really worried about where the next dollar was coming from in America, and there was a story about two very good-looking people living in a nice house, you know, obsessing about whether they're going to move to Paris or not. It was just a badly timed film. And on top of that, it was freighted with these sort of, you know, award expectations because of who was in it and who had made it and all of those things. But I think if you get past all that, and one of the nice things about movies is that you can and you do look back with some sort of greater knowledge, you know, several years later, I think what you see is actually a really well-made film, which with very, very truthful performances in it. There's a great performance in it as well. There are several, but Michael Shannon is brilliant in it as well, and he's gone on to great things since then. But that was really his first major screen role.
So obviously thinking about this a lot, thinking about the kind of through line in your work, which I'm finding very hard to find, in fact. There's one very constant through line, which is your collaboration with Thomas Newman.
Yes.
Who's done all but one of your films. Can you talk a little bit about finding him in the first place and how you've kind of moved from film to film with him?
Well, I was very fortunate. I was a big fan of Tom Newman's work. I remember hearing the score for Shawshank Redemption, which I think is one of the great. It's a great movie and it's a great score. And I'd sort of set my heart on trying to persuade him to do American Beauty. But in those circumstances, he was the senior one and I was the junior. So I was trying desperately to persuade him to do this little movie for nothing. And he wrote an unbelievable score for American Beauty, so varied and so nuanced. And so witty and with so much fun and zest in it. And I'm a big believer in if someone has talent, they have the talent to expand and change and develop and work in ways that they perhaps never worked in before. But, you know, I think that he's incredibly gifted and somebody that you just have a shared language with. I think that, for me, the best collaborators, you get a kind of, you know, if anyone else were to listen to it, it would be a collection of bad jokes, you know, catchphrases, odd little quirks. You know, you read each other very quickly. He knows very quickly when I don't like a piece, just from the way I am in the room. You muddle along. And also the best collaborators know when to say no to you, you know. I don't want to do that. I don't think that's right, you know. And to have the courage to do that. And I'm very willful, and, you know, like any director, I'm constantly pushing and pushing for a singular vision. And they will often say, somebody like Roger or Conrad or Tom Newman, I don't think that's right. And those are the ones you've got to hold on to, because they're talented and they have an opinion.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
How do we end this? This country needs to be ready for war.
A perfectly crafted production. Sky Arts, proudly sponsored by Lexus.
Sam, you couldn't have made a more different step next, when, of course, you became the director of the next Bond. That seems the most bizarre step I've ever imagined.
My way in was Daniel. I mean, I've never made any secret of that. Daniel I cast in Road to Perdition. I'd known him for 10, 15 years. They called me to say, we hear this rumour that Daniel Craig is going to be cast as Bond just before Casino Royale. What do you think? And I said, and I'm on record as saying, I think it's a terrible idea. Because at that point, you know, Bond for me was Pierce Brosnan, and Roger Moore was a kind of urbane, you know, slightly kind of eyebrow-raising, cool, but slightly detached figure, who dealt mostly in irony. And, you know, Daniel was all truth and reality and intensity and toughness. And I felt I didn't see how the two could go together. But of course, as soon as they did cast him, and I saw the movie, I thought it was thrilling, and it reminded me of what it felt like to see the early Bond movies with Sean. So for me, my way in was Daniel, and I was trying to find a way to come back to England. I felt I wanted to make an English film. I also wanted to make a film on a large scale again, because I hadn't for a while. And I went to a party in New York. We were living in New York at the time. And there was Daniel. It was always lovely to see him. I'd just seen his play that he'd been in with Hugh Jackman a couple of weeks earlier. And he had a couple of drinks. And I said, he just made Quantum of Solace. And I said, so who's going to do the next one? And he said, I don't know. Why don't you do it? And I honestly had not thought about it until that moment. The moment he said it, I thought, yeah, why not? And I remember just going over it in my mind, thinking, is there a catch? Is that a terrible idea? Is that the right or the wrong thing to do? But every time, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, there's something to do here. I feel in tune with him, and hearing him talk about it really got me engaged. And then it grew from there. Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson found me in New York, took me out to lunch, and asked me why I wanted to do it. And I think I said something like, I want to be the coolest dad in the school, or something like that, which was partly true as well. That was the other thing. I wanted to do a movie that my kids could see. Yeah. And so, crafting the screenplay of Skyfall, I found myself steering the writers, who were all brilliant, into writing a movie about someone who goes away from England and comes back to find that everything is changed, which really is, in a sense, what I'd gone through, and forces them to explain and define why they are who they are and why they do their job and what the point of Bond is, and by inference, what the point of MI6 and the whole Secret Service is. And beyond that, what's the point of Bond movies? You know, that felt like the debate that was going through my head when we were making Skyfall.
Do I get on the train?
Don't get on the train, I'm not sure he's on it. Give us a minute.
Do I get on the train?
Bond?
What?
Get on the train.
He's keen to get home.
I wonder whether there's ever a point with a Bond film where you're literally just directing a film, as in getting the right performances out of actors, or whether there's always the kind of weight of, you know, the stuff that goes around it.
Yes, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, you know, I call it the white noise, and it goes on, you know, all the time when you're making a Bond movie. And, you know, I think it's partly, you know, your job to cut it out from your own immediate environment, but also to help the actors get away from it as well, because, you know, they're constantly being reminded of other versions of these stories. And, you know, what happens, I think, with larger movies now is that you're in a dialogue with the audience from a very early stage. You know, your audience is commenting on and reviewing the title, you know, the press conference, the casting, the song, the trailer, the second trailer, the poster, you know, and it's a constant dialogue that goes on for sort of, you know, 18 months. And so you have to just create a world around the camera which is absolutely private. And that doesn't matter whether it's the largest scene in the movie or the smallest. You can only shoot one thing at a time. You know, you can only point the camera in one direction at a time. Concentrate on what you're doing and push everything else away.
But presumably there's all the noise, not just from the people out there, us, you know, giving our tuppence worth about what you might be doing with our precious Bond, but there's all the people who are involved, the writers who have a big stake, producers you've already mentioned. I mean, how do you navigate the kind of your own vision when you've got all those kind of potentially opposing views on the other side?
The writers, I think, are, you know, not look, film is a director's medium. You know, if you want to work in a writer's medium, go and do a play. If I say we're cutting 2 pages of dialogue on screen, we're cutting 2 pages of dialogue. Deal with it. Let's work it out. Let's work out how we can reshape the scene. You know, you have to be the leader. You have to lead the set, and you have to lead the writers, because they don't know what the movie is. Your movie is 8 months. You're in the depths of the woods. The only person, and I truly believe this, certainly with a big film, who has the whole film or some version of the whole film in his head is the director. And everyone is looking to you for that level of leadership. And you have to describe what it is that they need to do. At the end of the day, you need to be very, very clear about what you want, and you have to keep going until you have it. And there are many times also when it's tricky, because, you know, you've got huge crews, they want to get home to their wives and family. You've done a stunt that you've been building up to for 6 hours. It involves explosions, and it goes well, and everyone's cheering and high-fiving each other, and you look at your 6 monitor screens, and you think, that's not the shot, that's not the shot, nope, we haven't got it. And you have to say, stop, we're doing it again. And every single person on set is looking at you like they're going to kill you, you know? And you have to be willing to be the person they're going to kill, okay? Because that's part of also being a director. All these things that go through your head. Where's the shot? Where's the shot that's going to carry it? Where's the shot that's going to convince me and the audience that this is actually happening? Because, you know, that's the other thing, is that you've got a baseline that you want, which is that only use CG and computer-generated image to supplement the real. Don't try and create anything from scratch, which is, you know, A, what Bond has traditionally done, and B, also my belief in how to make films. So there's that going on as well. So, you know, there's a lot happening all at the same time.
We're going to have a look at what you made of Mexico.
Where are you going?
I won't be long.
So how many days did you close down Mexico City?
Oh, gosh. We were there for about 2 weeks, I think. And one of the things, the reason I chose the clip, obviously, it's one shot, and it's, 4 minutes or whatever. When I decided to do another Bond movie, I had to sort of look at the first film. I looked at Skyfall and thought, okay, well, what do I want to do differently, and how do I want to change things? And one of the things I felt with Skyfall was the first 10 minutes felt a little relentless. It felt through-scored. It felt lacking in rhythm. But I feel like one of the things you get for free with a Bond movie is the first 10 minutes. You don't have to explain who your central character is. You don't really have to explain the tone. You have the ability, the chance, to drop an audience right into the middle of something and tell them nothing about it, and there's 10 minutes free time. So not only do they know the actor, they know the character. And that's something you get with Bond, which you would never have with another movie, where you're not having to introduce the world. And I wanted to do something that had a different kind of rhythm, that shifted rhythm within it, these 10 minutes. It's sort of, now this, obviously I'm very proud of it technically, but really its job is to reel you in gradually, show you the world, gradually get closer to Bond, and then zero in on what he's looking at. And then, of course, it all goes haywire. There's a gun battle, the building collapses, there's a chase through the streets, there's a huge fight in a helicopter, but all of which is shifts of rhythm. So what you're doing is shifting perspectives and tonally moving things around. And that's what I hope you do across the whole movie. A great movie breathes in and breathes out. A sequence breathes in and breathes out. So the way I look at that shot is it's a long inhale until bang, the whole thing goes off. But in terms of actually the high spot of shooting the movie, that was it. Because it doesn't just depend on the coordination of 2,000 fully costumed extras and, you know, Daniel walking at exactly the right speed and the camera operator, but also stuff like going, you know, really there are morphs in that shot that blend one shot to the other. So when you walk into the lobby of the hotel, you're walking into a hotel that actually wasn't there. It was further down the street. When you come into the hotel room, you're going to Pinewood. When you come out of the hotel room, you're going onto a rooftop in Mexico. Not only a rooftop in Mexico, a rooftop with 350 feet of track and a techno crane, you know, and God knows how many crew manipulating that so that we see everything beyond, including the musicians and the maquettes and the giant puppets that were made by the good people of Mexico City. 2,500 people working in tandem at the same time is a really big high for a director. God. When everyone gets it right, it's very exhilarating. And it's not just for the director, for the crew as well. You have people who've been on crews for 40 years, who've made 14 Bond movies saying, I've never seen anything like this. And that was really exhilarating for me. And that, I thought, you know, I looked around on a couple of days of Mexico City and I thought, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to see this kind of thing again. I'm just going to soak it up because it is amazing when you see it. And the analogy I use is a surfing analogy. You know, when you're trying to catch the big wave, you get wiped out a lot, but when you catch it, you get wiped out. You'll happily get wiped out another 10 times, looking for that high that you feel when everything goes the way you imagine. And then through the hard work and brilliance of so many thousands of people, you can realize it. It's a pretty amazing job to have, and it's a very, very wonderful privilege to be able to do it, and to know that an audience will also come and see it too.
In this case, you're the only person that can do that. Thank you so much, Sam Mendes.
Thank you.